It's one of the most tumultuous regions of the world, and it's been that way for thousands of years, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be getting any better. From Gazan rockets to the Arab Spring, the Middle East's future is unclear. Hi there, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle, and this is PJTV. This is part one of a four-part special discussion series about the future of the Middle East. And to get a more in-depth look at what's in store for this explosive region, we have some absolutely great panelists with me here today. First of all, she's a best-selling author, the host of the Tammy Bruce radio program at TammyBruce.com, and a regular on PJTV's Rundown. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Tammy Bruce.
Hey there.
And sitting right next to her, of course, is the executive director of the Ayn Rand Institute and a former first sergeant in the Israeli Military Intelligence Division. His columns have appeared in Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. It's Dr. Yaron Brook. Dr. Brook, good to see you. And unfortunately, sitting beside me here is an award-winning novelist who's extremely popular. Klavan on the culture about Israel and Palestine, called The One-State Solution, is available at the PJTV store. I know him as my co-host on the Klavan Whittle Show. It's Andrew Klavan, ladies and gentlemen. I keep waiting for the applause, but the applause is thundering out in internet land that we don't get to hear. Well, guys, in this segment, we're going to discuss Israel, which, of course, is one of America's strongest allies, its outlook in the region, and which, of course, is pretty hostile at this point, kind of surrounded by enemies. So why don't we start here? We recently had an incursion, as once again, another incursion into the Gaza Strip to stop these rockets being fired at Israel. There's apparently a peace, not a peace agreement, I suppose more like a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. Yaron, let's start with you. You live there. My perspective is that these constant peace agreements do nothing but simply prolong the brutal reality of the fact that something there is going to have to change.
Well, there's no question. Anytime you compromise with evil, you lose. Every time Israel negotiates with Hamas, has a ceasefire with Hamas, it loses. I think it lost the most recent incursion. I think it lost with Hezbollah in the past. You can't negotiate with people committed to killing you. The only alternative is to destroy them. You have to bring Hamas to its knees. You have to destroy the regime there. And you have to do whatever is necessary in order to achieve that. And that's unpopular in the world. But long-term, Israel's survival depends on it.
Tammy, Israel's unpopular in the world right now. I mean, they're not going to suddenly win popularity contests. They've been demonized in the way that the left demonizes people by making the underdog somehow the automatic moral superior, regardless of what their positions are on beheadings or women in sacks or stringing up homosexuals or that kind of thing. Automatically, the guy with the rock is the winner, the guy with the tank's the bad guy. So I think Yaron has got a great point. What do they do? Do you think that Israel is limited by its own decency, or do you think that they're limited by their own lack of will to act?
I think that it's the interconnection of what's happening in the world. For the longest time, if not forever, America, the United States, has told them to limit themselves. That there is a very strange dynamic that's occurred when it comes to what not only, and we see it even with the American approach now with terrorism, is that there's this strange belief that you can't win. Yeah, that right. It will never end.
Right.
That you can't, how many times we heard in the last month, you can't beat them militarily. Well, I think the World War II generation would scoff at that, because you can. But you have to be willing to wipe out the enemy. You've got to be willing to do it. I also think, though, that there is something that happens when it comes to populations, in controlling your own populations. Before, Americans were controlled to some degree with the Soviet Union and the threat of communism and that dynamic. Now that's gone. And now we have a framework of where you can, pass new laws, you can have more controls over populations by noting, well, look at the enemy, it's right there at our border. I'm not suggesting that's what Israel is doing, but really it ends up being death by 1,000 cuts. That you push them back, you just limit it enough, but it becomes this perpetual, horrible problem. There is, unfortunately, I think, going to be a point where no one's going to have a choice, where it is going to be a war, where it's going to have to end. And frankly, look, we didn't have to wipe out the Japanese or the Germans or the Italians. But what you do,
defeat them.
You have to bring them to their knees.
You have to bring them to their knees. You have to truly defeat them, and culturally and otherwise. And that's what we did, and that's the only solution here.
But you see, I think the challenge is this. Why is it that we're so weak in the West? That's the real question.
That's where I was going.
Right? Why is it that America can't win a war? Why is it that Israel can't do what is necessary for its own defense? You're right. They're unpopular anyway. And I think this is much more fundamental. I think that it's the ideas that have shifted in the West over the last 50, 60 years, ideas about what it means to assert oneself, whether one has a right. You see that with multiculturalism. Mm-hmm. How can I bring another country to its knees when we're all the same? There's no difference between cultures. There's no difference between Israelis and the Palestinians. It's just an issue of circumstances. It's the philosophical ideas that drive cultures and drive us to this position of weakness. We admire sacrifice, which leads us to admire the underdog. We admire people who don't assert themselves. So we don't want Israel to assert itself, and we, as Americans, don't assert ourselves. I mean, look at the pathetic response we had to 9/11 when 3,000 Americans died, and we dropped food packages and bombs on the same people. I mean, that was pathetic weakness.
Well, hold on. After 9/11, we removed the government of Afghanistan and Iraq. The difference here is, I think, look, I don't think anybody can really argue that Israel is our ally because Israel is a small outpost of Western civilization in the Middle East.
This is what I find so disturbing. What I find so disturbing about that last incursion was not what the Israelis did, it's what our press did and what so much of America did. How did the world turn so far upside down that we sit around ticking off the casualties in what is a war of survival and sort of blaming Israel when the score goes over a certain point? That's what the New York Times was doing. They were saying, well, here are the casualties of innocent bystanders who, of course, Hamas is placing purposely to get them killed because they know it sways that kind of opinion. But how did we get to this point?
I think
I don't think America. See, America is different because America doesn't have to win wars. America is so powerful; it just has to disrupt its enemies. That's all it really has to do. Israel has to win. They have to win to survive, or at least keep an aura of protection around them in order to stay alive.
There's something I think that I don't hear anybody talking about this, but I think there's something really profound, or certainly from the leftists in Europe and the sort of the international leftist community. I think one of the things that we're seeing with the demonization of Israel, you'd mentioned in one of the shows that we did that you thought that this Western lack of belief in itself, because that's what it is. Israel is part of the West, and the West has lost confidence in itself. And I think you said it was actually the Nazi atrocities that fundamentally undercut this idea of Western civilization. So what I'm actually wondering is this. I have felt for quite a long time that by turning Israel into the Nazis, what the left is really doing and what Western Europeans are really doing is they're sort of relieving themselves of this ongoing guilt for what they did. In other words, if they're really murderers and Nazis, the Israelis, well, then what we did to them maybe wasn't quite as bad as they were if they were just an innocent people.
But that doesn't explain the fact that Americans participate in this. We're counting the casualties. And with all due respect, yes, America doesn't have to win wars, but it would be better if we did.
It would be nice occasionally.
So the fact that, and it would be better if we did it once so thoroughly that we wouldn't have to go to the same place over and over again. So that there is a bigger problem here that is not unique to Jews and not unique to the Nazi experience. And it has to do with the fact that the West feels that it can't impose itself in any way, that it can't fight. We've elevated civilian casualties to some moral plane that is unthinkable, that basically guarantees that we will always not win the war. Yeah. We might not lose it, but we won't win
that's
it.
Right.
And Israel is part of this. Look, internally in Israel, they were counting civilian casualties at Hamas. It wasn't that this is somehow and because Israel is a part of the West, Israel suffers from the same philosophical undermining that is occurring everywhere else in the West.
Let me suggest the one new element, of course, since World War II is the United Nations.
Well, let's talk about
that. The international message from the UN, which has had to be pushed back constantly, is that Israel's the problem. And we've had to push back. John Bolton at one point ended the anti-Zionist resolution that was moving through the UN, as Netanyahu said in his speech, that the Human Rights Council there is turned into the Terrorist Council, that you've got this absurdity unfolding that sends a message and allows these small terrorist nations to band together to have this sense of this is what is correct, this is what the United Nations wants in the world, and that Israel's the problem. But this, of course, we know is not new. Jew hatred has been a part of civilization from the beginning, and this is not new.
Okay, so let's go to that. But it was the United Nations. Is one of their first acts of the United Nations was to consult essentially the entire world for the creation of this Jewish state. The entire
but that was right after World War II.
But that just goes to show how much the United Nations has changed.
No, the United Nations hasn't changed. Look, the United Nations was a corrupt institution from the beginning, and I think its establishment is one of the early signs of the decay of the West. The United Nations placed Stalin and Eisenhower at the same table. Or Mao Zedong, by the way, killed 60 million people through starvation, right? At the same table, moral equivalency of those three guys.
Excellent point.
immediately says the United Nations is one of the most immoral, illegitimate institutions in human history. And it's very founding. The idea of this egalitarian notion that all countries are equal is the beginning of this multiculturalism trend.
That's right.
And that's what we're seeing today in the world today.
So the United Nations was originally intended to raise every nation up to the standards of Western democracies, and all it's done is pull Western democracies down to the standards of liberty.
You wouldn't put Stalin there if that was its intention. My argument is it was never intended to do that.
So one of the things that you often hear among people who have very limited historical background and moral depth, I might add, is this idea, well, you know, the problem is that Israel's in Israel. Why not give the Jews a homeland someplace else? The Stalin, as you were saying, was talking about there's going to be a Crimean California for the Jews in the 30s and 40s, and a lot of people are saying if you just get the Jewish nation out of Jerusalem and move them into Iowa or Switzerland or Madagascar, where apparently Hitler presumably wanted to ship them all before he killed them all. Would somebody please address the absurdity of the fact that the Jewish nation, which has been in that territory for 5,000 to 6,000 years, somehow does not have legitimacy to a claim compared to a religion that's 600 or 700 years old?
I think we should go back just for a minute to what Tammy said and to what you said about Jew hatred, because Jew hatred is a theme especially in Western history for at least 2,000 years and longer, and it is a core. It is a shadow of Western thought. It is something that infested Western thought through the idea of theocide, and it forms this kind of dark other.
Yeah, it's the great unspoken, isn't it? Yeah, it's a great.
And it keeps coming back. And the idea that people, and at the New York Times, people of intelligence, people of sophistication could allow this to become their language once again so soon
and
after
American
this Holocaust.
Jews, liberal American Jews.
And liberal American Jews, of course. That's always where it starts.
That's the New York Times.
And I think that the idea of that is repellent and horrifying. And if there was no other reason to defend Israel, if it were not the only democracy in the West, in the Middle East, if it were not the only civilized country among all these savages, that would still be a reason. We have to defend them, if only to become who we should become.
Well, let's talk about that domestic aspect of the state of Israel and Israel's existence, because it's not a fiction, it's not an invention, that American Jews vote for the policies that virtually guarantee the extinction of the Israeli state. And it's the American Christian conservatives, really, who are their best friends in terms of the politics of making sure that Israel stays alive, at least as far as its big backup in the United States goes. So I know this is a question that has befuddled so many of our viewers. I'd like to get your takes, each one of your takes, on why is it that American Jews seem so incapable of understanding what the left that they keep voting for is going to do to this Jewish homeland?
Well, this is the bigger question of why are Jews so leftist, right? Because why are Jews committed to the liberal cause that undermines their own success, right, under capitalism? Jews have benefited from capitalism enormously, maybe more than any other small ethnic group, right? And yet they undercut that. There's something about Jews worldwide that's self-hating. There's something about that's self-denying. There's a strong sense of guilt. We were once oppressed. Now the Palestinians are oppressed. Right. Therefore, we need to project that onto them. And there's no sense, again, Jews reflect kind of Western civilization in a sense on steroids. So if the rest of the West feels guilty, if the rest of the West feels bad, the Jews in America feel it even more intensely.
One second, but you're not only Jewish, you're an Israeli. How do the Israelis view American Jews in this what seems to be a suicidal voting pattern for the people who are in that little tiny country surrounded by 1 billion enemies?
But many Israelis are big fans of Obama. Remember, Israel is not this radically right-wing, pro-self-defense place. Israel is very European philosophically. It's absorbed many of the ideas from Europe. All the kids growing up with me read Sartre and Camus. They're very existentialist. They're for defending themselves, and they sympathize with the American Jews to a large extent. They resent them for voting for Obama specifically with regard to Israel, but they share much of their liberal ideology.
If I just may add, that I think when it comes to Jewish people who are liberals, what eclipses the Jewishness is their liberalism.
Yes.
And it's the constant daily reinforcement about liberalism, and you see what Democrats do. They vote all the time on things that destroy their own lives. So it wouldn't necessarily be a big difference when it comes to the impact on Israel and the choices that are made. And God forbid, though, that you be a liberal Jewish person who is also hawkish, because that's the nature of really being an American first. And they're there, the Republican Jewish Coalition, other friends of mine who are liberals and Democrats who love Israel and love this country. So it's about liberalism and politics more than it is even self-identity.
What do you say, Drew?
Well, on a panel full of atheists, I feel just obligated.
Oh, I do not like organized religion. I believe in God very much.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
My own personal.
I won't call myself that either.
All right, good.
Okay, so there's only one atheist. Sorry.
But I do feel obligated.
We'll take care of you. Don't worry. You're covered.
That's right. Well, you're taking you with us. I do feel obligated to point out that multiculturalism is essentially a Judeo-Christian heresy. It's what you get when you have ideas of forgiveness and compassion, and you take away the strong moral rock, that moral center that comes from the spirituality of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And I think that this kind of self-hatred is just a philosophy turning in on itself when it becomes hollow. When you take out the center of that philosophy, it just crumbles in on itself. And I think I watch Jews essentially supporting Hamas, which is not only wants to wipe them out, but is evil in and of itself. And I think to myself, this is what happens when you lose your core, when you lose your center of what you believe, and it's been happening to the Jews, unfortunately, since Karl Marx.
I think that's it's what you'd mentioned earlier about the ability. When I say discrimination, I mean the ability to discriminate, to say one thing is better than another thing, and not just different, better. When you lose that ability to see that one side is using children as weapons and the other side are using their soldiers to defend the other side's children, then you have two different animals that are not on the same moral plane. This inability that has been drummed into the American population for 40 years now of leftism, that you can't say that this is better than, well, I certainly can say that it's better than that. They can say the Jewish state is a better state and in every way is better than Hamas. It's better morally, it's better intellectually, it's better spiritually, it's better in every way. All I wanted to say about this business about children bombers and this sort of terrorist business with Hamas is, if I was a Palestinian or if I was a person who was living and thought that Israel was the enemy, I might be willing to fight them. I'd try to fight them in uniform. If I was desperate enough, maybe I wouldn't. But if it ever came to the point where I felt like my only recourse was to take my children and strap a bomb on them and send them out, then I would surrender before I would become that inhuman. And that's really what we're dealing with here, is the fundamental inhumanity of this enemy.
Yes, absolutely. Fundamentally inhuman, believing in a cause that rewards them after death, and that's why they're willing to do this, because of the kind of mysticism
for murder.
Yes, for rewarding them after death for murder, which is, by the way, a long tradition in religion. But look, Israel's claim. You earlier talked about what is Israel's claim on that piece of land. Israel's claim on that piece of land, in my view, is not historic. It's not about 5,000 years. It's not about God promising them or anything like that. Israel's claim on that land is that they built it. People's blood, sweat, and tears went into creating a country, a great country, a free country, a country in which individual rights, for the most part, are respected. Even the Arabs who live there have more rights than they do in any other country. They built skyscrapers, they dried swamps, they build industry. They created something, and to take that and say, oh, we'll just move them somewhere else. Talk about violating people's life work.
But the notion of that, and I'll be brief, the notion of even considering moving the Jews somewhere else diminishes the importance of that group of people. The fact is, you've got two choices with the Jews. You can be jealous and envious and as a result hostile, or you can appreciate the fact that they've created Western civilization and be grateful that they're here and that maybe they'll be your friends.
And I think we should also question why, when after two world wars, dozens of nations were created, masses of populations were moved around. This one alone,
and
this one alone has to be moved and destroyed.
Of every Arab country with men who were herders, sheep herders, elevated to royalty by Winston Churchill, and that's considered legitimate.
Yeah. Wow. And none of the problems in the Middle East, let's end on this, right? Not a single one of the problems in the Middle East are Israel's fault. That is, if you lose Israel, it's just as violent, it's just as radical, it's just as horrific a place as it is right now.
The thing I'd like to close on in terms of this hatred for this country is not just the historical hatred of the Jews. You mentioned it in passing, I think, Tammy. The bottom line is you can go to the Middle East today and stand on the Golan Heights or any other place with any altitude, and you can look out into the desert and you can see as if somebody drew with a razor. On one side there are irrigated orchards, on the other side there's sand and wasteland. I think the hatred of the Jews is the hatred for the Western idea that we can make things better. Their existence shows the people in that region what they could be if they simply got up and worked a little harder. And this aspect of Jewishness goes back to Old Testament times, the stories of the Philistines taking wells that the Israelis had dug, and the first thing they did was fill the wells in with sand. This business of smashing greenhouses that would provide, they'd just taken possession of them. The work that you'd mentioned earlier, Yaron, that was done by the sweat of Israelis has provided them with greenhouses in which figs and dates and everything were being grown. First thing they did was smash them to glass because of that sense of self-hatred, and I think that sense of intolerance of the idea that there was a group of people there that thought that they could make life better. That's all we have time for in our first segment today, but please be sure to join us for part 2 when we're going to discuss the possibility of Iran getting a nuclear weapon and what that'll mean for the rest of the world. Thank you, gentlemen, ladies, for joining us today. You can always follow Andrew Klavan on Twitter at Andrew Klavan and watch our show together, Klavan and Whittle. Half of it's actually pretty good, believe it or not. The other half's kind of filler that we just put in just to stretch it out a little bit. It's right here on PJTV.
Which half?
Yeah. Well, that's what the show's about, actually. You can always read Tammy Bruce's columns at the Washington Times and go to her website, which is tammybruce.com, for her radio show and other updates. And, of course, you can always go to theaynrand.org for more info on Yaron Brook, Dr. Brook, and also you can find out more about the incredible Ayn Rand Institute. Needless to say, of course, you can see me here on Trifecta Hot Seat and look for my afterburners. All of them are right here on PJTV. I'm Bill Whittle. For everyone else, thanks very much for watching this important PJTV special discussion series, and we'll see you for part 2.